Imagine a man so blinded by greed, so consumed by the rush of cards and chance, that he wagered away not just his fortune, not just his land, but his own flesh and blood. In the year 1847, deep in the heart of Virginia, where the soil was tilled by enslaved hands, and the mansions of masters stood tall as monuments to both wealth and cruelty, one decision would ignite whispers that never died. It was not merely a bet, it was a betrayal, a desecration of family, and a reflection of how far the human soul can sink when power and arrogance collide with desperation. Picture the setting. The air heavy with cigar smoke, glasses of brandy clinking on polished oak tables, the laughter of men who believed themselves untouchable. They were lords of the South, plantation masters who measured their worth not in kindness or wisdom, but in acres of land and the number of lives they claimed as property. And among them sat one man whose arrogance burned brighter than most, a man whose addiction to poker was both his pride and his poison. On that night, his hunger to win would lead him to a decision so shocking, so unthinkable, that even his fellow masters sat in stunned silence. This was not just another poker game. This was the night when a master, losing hand after hand, running out of coin, livestock and land, turned his gaze toward the only thing left he had to offer. Not another slave, not another plot of soil, but his own daughter. His flesh and blood, the innocent girl whose life was bound to his by blood and name. With a cold grin and a trembling hand, he placed her life on the table, wagering her existence against the life of an enslaved man. A man society refused to see as human, yet in that moment, his worth was measured against the master's very own bloodline. What followed was not merely the ruin of a man. It was the stain of shame that spread across Virginia, a story whispered in parlors and back rooms, passed from lip to lip like a cautionary tale of sin and downfall. The gamble was more than reckless. It was symbolic of everything that corrupted the heart of the South. Greed, cruelty, the belief that human beings could be owned, wagered and discarded like tokens in a game of chance. But let us slow down. To understand the weight of this moment, we must first step back into Virginia as it was in 1847. A world where the clash between wealth and morality, between freedom and enslavement, between honor and greed, defined every breath taken on its soil. Before we can sit at that table and watch the cards fall, we must walk through the grand halls of the Old Dominion, breathe in the poisoned air of its plantations, and meet the people, both free and enslaved, whose lives were entwined in this tragedy. And so, as we leave behind the echo of that shocking bet, let us move into the world that made it possible. The Virginia of 1847, a land as beautiful as it was brutal, where elegance and cruelty walked hand in hand. Only then will we be ready to witness how a single poker game shattered a legacy. The year was 1847, and Virginia stood as both a crown jewel of the South and a cradle of contradictions. To the outsider, it was a land of rolling hills, fertile soil, and sprawling plantations that stretched further than the eye could see. The rivers carried the lifeblood of trade, the tobacco fields painted the horizon in shades of green, and the mansions, white-pillared, imposing, and carefully manicured, declared the wealth of their masters to anyone who passed. Yet beneath this polished surface, Virginia was a land rotting from within. For every acre of land tilled, there were enslaved hands breaking under the sun. For every grand ball and social gathering of the elite, there was a hidden world of suffering, where human beings were treated as currency, traded, beaten, and silenced. The social order was strict, unyielding, and enforced by fear. Plantation masters believed themselves to be kings in their own realms, ruling over both land and lives with unchecked authority. Their wives maintained the illusion of refinement, draped in silks and pearls, though many turned blind eyes to the cruelty on which their comfort was built. Their sons were raised to inherit this empire of domination, taught that honor came not from compassion, but from power, wealth, and control. Their daughters, often caught between innocence and expectation, were pawns in a larger game, married off to secure alliances, their fates rarely their own. And towering over all was the institution of slavery, the engine that kept Virginia's wealth alive. even as it corroded its soul. By 1847, Virginia was not untouched by the growing debates that stirred the nation. Whispers of abolition were spreading, newspapers carried fiery words from the North, and some Southerners began to feel the tremors of unease. But for the ruling class of Virginia, these whispers were easily drowned out by the clinking of glasses at poker tables, by the rustle of cards being shuffled in private rooms where fortunes could be won or lost in a single hand. Gambling was not just a pastime, it was a ritual, a test of courage, pride, and manhood. For men who already held power over others, the poker table was one of the few places where they felt the thrill of risk, where arrogance could blind them, and desperation could break them. It was in this world that our story unfolded. Imagine a long wooden table in a candlelit parlor, shadows dancing across velvet curtains. Around it sat men with faces hardened by years of entitlement, each one puffing cigars, their voices booming with laughter and bravado. These men wagered not only money but pride. To lose was humiliation, to win was proof of superiority. And as the stakes rose higher, so too did the recklessness of their bets. Horses, land, and even human lives were placed on the table as if they were nothing more than chips in the game. The culture of gambling thrived because it mirrored the very structure of Virginia's society, built on the dehumanization of others and sustained by the illusion of invincibility. But Virginia was more than its masters. Behind the white walls of the mansions, in the fields stretching endlessly, lived thousands of enslaved men, women, and children whose voices were silenced by chains but whose presence was inescapable. They were the invisible backbone of every wealthy household, forced to labor, endure, and survive in a system designed to break them. Some prayed for deliverance. Others plotted quiet acts of resistance. Many clung to family bonds, the only anchor in a world that sought to tear them apart. For them, the poker tables of the masters were cruel spectacles, reminders that their lives could be shuffled, dealt, and discarded at will. And yet, in this strange, brutal society, appearances were everything. Virginia prided itself on honor, tradition, and civility. But honor meant little when greed ruled the hearts of men. Civility was nothing more than a mask, hiding the corruption festering beneath. It was this very contradiction, grandeur on the surface, rot underneath, that made Virginia fertile ground for a story as dark as the one we are telling now. A story where a single man's obsession with cards collided with his arrogance as a master, and the result was not just his ruin, but the tarnishing of Virginia's very name. So when we imagine the poker game of 1847, we must not see it as an isolated act of madness. It was the inevitable product of a society drunk on power, where men gambled with everything, believing themselves immune to consequences. And it was within this world, this Virginia poised between wealth and downfall, that one man sat at the table, his pride outweighing his reason, his greed drowning out the cries of conscience. As the candlelight flickered and the cards fell into place, this master would take his place in history, not as a man of honor, not as a guardian of family legacy, but as the gambler who wagered his daughter against a slave. To understand him, we must now step closer into his life, his mind, and his fatal flaw, for the story cannot move forward until we meet the man himself. He was the kind of man who believed that the world bent to his will, that the soil of Virginia itself obeyed him because generations before had carved their empire into its hills. His name, spoken in parlors and on courthouse steps, carried weight, enough to open doors, enough to silence rivals. He was a plantation master, born into privilege, and from the moment he could walk, he was taught that others existed only to serve him. Wealth was his inheritance, arrogance his birthright, and power his constant companion. Yet behind this facade of control and respectability lurked a flaw so deep that it would one day consume him: his addiction to cards. From his youth, he sought the thrill of risk. While other young men of Virginia polished their manners or prepared to inherit their father's estates, he gravitated toward smoke-filled taverns and back rooms, places where dice clattered and cards slapped against worn tables. The rush of the gamble, of staking something valuable on the turn of a card, filled a void inside him that nothing else could. Winning made him feel invincible, Losing only made him more desperate to reclaim what was his. By the time he reached manhood, gambling was no longer a pastime. It was a hunger that ruled him, a shadow whispering in his ear with every breath. But this master was not just a gambler. He was a father. His daughter was the one pure light in his life, untouched by the arrogance and cruelty that shaped him. To neighbors he boasted of her beauty, her innocence, and the legacy she represented. To her he was both protector and prison. She adored him, yet she also feared the storm that often brewed in his eyes when cards or whiskey stirred his temper. She did not know that in her father's heart, love and recklessness wrestled constantly, and that one night, recklessness would win. To his enslaved people, he was no different than most masters of Virginia, a man who treated their labor as owed, their pain as irrelevant, their lives as property. He could be charming in public, boasting of fairness, speaking of his duty as if he were a benevolent king. But behind closed doors, his temper was cruel and his disregard for their humanity absolute. They knew him not as a man of honor, but as a tyrant who valued wealth and pleasure above all else. And yet, one enslaved man among them, sharp-eyed, strong-willed, would one day find himself seated across from him at a poker table, bound not by choice but by fate. In gatherings, the master was magnetic. He told stories that filled rooms with laughter, his voice carrying like a performer's. He wore the finest coats, his boots polished to a shine, his pockets heavy with coins that clinked whenever he gestured. But those who looked closer saw the cracks. His debts whispered through the county, merchants muttered about unpaid accounts, and even other masters smirked at how often he boasted of winnings that never seemed to last. For every victory he proclaimed, there were 5 losses he buried in silence. His fortune was not endless, and each hand of cards chipped away at his empire, one reckless bet at a time. Still, he believed himself untouchable. Pride shielded him from reality. When he walked into a room, he saw not the walls closing in on his legacy, but the limitless chances the cards would offer him. Luck, he believed, was his ally. It had to be, because if luck abandoned him, everything else would collapse. His wealth, his name, his family. And so he played and played and played until the very act of gambling was not a choice, but the only way he knew to feel alive. This was the man who would one night sit at a poker table in Virginia, surrounded by fellow masters, smoke and candlelight. This was the man who would let his greed blind him so thoroughly that he would place his daughter's life on the table as though she were a coin or a card. To understand that moment, we must see him for what he was. Not just a villain, not just a fool, but a man torn apart by his own flaws. A father who loved, but whose love was powerless against his hunger for risk. A master who commanded lives but could not command himself. A gambler whose downfall was written in every hand he ever played. And so, with his portrait painted in arrogance and desperation, we prepare to meet the silent witness who shared his fate. A man treated as less than human, yet whose dignity and quiet strength would stand in sharp contrast to the master's ruin. For while the master was reckless and proud, the enslaved man across from him carried something the master never could: resilience born of suffering. Humanity forged in chains. He had no name in the records, no legacy written in the ledgers of Virginia's great families, no monument to declare that he had once lived. To the world of 1847, he was only property, a shadow listed beside horses and tools, his value measured in dollars rather than dignity. And yet, though history sought to erase him, his presence in this story is undeniable, for it was his life, his very existence, that became the weight on the other side of the master's most reckless bet. He was a man born into chains. His first breath taken not as a free child, but as an inheritance passed down like land, enslaved because his parents were enslaved before him. From the moment he could walk, he worked. The sun was his companion, blistering his back as he bent over fields that were never his. His hands, rough and scarred, bore the evidence of years of toil, planting, cutting, carrying, building. Yet behind his weary body lived a mind sharp as any man's, a heart that beat with the same longing for freedom as those who claimed to own him. Unlike the master, whose voice carried across rooms in loud bravado. The enslaved man lived in silence. His words were careful, measured, for every syllable could draw punishment if spoken at the wrong time. He learned to watch more than he spoke, to read the moods of those who held his fate in their hands. In that silence, however, grew wisdom. He saw the hypocrisy of men who called themselves noble while wagering human lives. He saw the fragility of power, how quickly fortunes crumbled when pride took the reins. And though he was forced to bow, to obey, he carried within him a strength no whip could break. Resilience. He was no stranger to loss. He had seen families torn apart, children sold from their mothers, wives separated from husbands. Perhaps he had known that pain himself. Or perhaps he lived each day with the fear that tomorrow it might come for him. In slavery, nothing was certain but suffering. Yet through it all, he endured. He found moments of quiet defiance in prayer, in song, in stolen smiles shared among those who labored beside him. He carried stories, memories, fragments of a world where freedom was more than a dream. And though society declared him less than human, those who looked closely could not deny the dignity in his bearing, the intelligence in his eyes. Even the master in his arrogance had noticed. Perhaps that was why he chose him, on that fateful night, as the counterweight to his own daughter in a game of chance. To the master it was an insult, a twisted boast that a slave's life could be equated with that of his blood. To the enslaved man, it was something darker. A reminder that his humanity was acknowledged only when it served the pride or folly of those who claimed to own him. When he was brought to the poker table, he did not walk as a free man. He came because he was told to, because refusal was not an option. Yet in his silence, he bore witness to a truth greater than the cards being played. He saw men stripped of their pretenses, revealing their greed, their desperation, their cruelty with every hand. And across from him sat the master, his eyes fevered with obsession, his hands trembling as he pushed more of his world onto the table. The enslaved man did not choose to be there, but fate, cruel as it was, placed him in the center of a moment that would echo far beyond that room. He was not the villain of this tale, nor its reckless architect. He was its silent witness, its unwilling participant, and in many ways, its moral compass. For while the master represented the corruption of wealth and power, the enslaved man embodied endurance. He was proof that even when stripped of freedom, humanity cannot be erased. His silence that night spoke louder than the master's boasts. His calm, more commanding than the laughter of men drunk on arrogance. And so, when his life was wagered against that of a daughter, the cruelty of Virginia was laid bare. Two lives so different in station, so bound by the chains of one man's arrogance, became tokens on a table. The girl, born free but helpless under her father's rule. The man, born enslaved, yet carrying within him a dignity her father had long since lost. Both victims, both trapped, and both forever scarred by the outcome of that night. History may not remember his name, but in the story of the bet that destroyed Virginia, his presence is eternal. Without him, the master's arrogance would have been just another tale of loss. With him, it became a mirror reflecting the cruelty of a society that gambled with human lives. And now, with the slave's silent figure seated at the table in our minds, the stage is set. The cards are shuffled, the candles flicker, and the air is heavy with anticipation. For the next chapter takes us to that very moment, the poker table itself, where desperation, pride, and fate collided in one unforgettable night. The parlor was alive with smoke, its heavy curtains pulled shut against the chill of a Virginia evening. Candles flickered in their brass holders, throwing long shadows across the walls as laughter and bravado filled the air. The scent of tobacco mixed with brandy hung thick, clinging to every surface. At the center of it all stood a long oak table, its surface polished smooth by years of restless hands and restless wagers. Around it, men leaned forward in anticipation, their eyes glinting with greed, their voices rising and falling with each shuffle of the cards. It was not just a game, it was a stage. And tonight, every man in the room would play his part in a drama that would outlast them all. The master sat with confidence that had been born of countless games before. though beneath his calm exterior pulsed a heart pounding with desperation. His fortunes had dwindled, his debts whispered in every corner of the county, and this night he believed, no, he knew, would be the night he reclaimed everything. Across from him sat rivals just as proud, men who smelled weakness like wolves circling prey. The cards shuffled, the bets began, and with each hand, the tension in the room grew heavier. At first, the master played with arrogance, tossing coins and notes onto the table with the flourish of a man certain of victory. The men laughed, the cigars glowed, and glasses clinked as fortunes shifted back and forth. But as the night wore on, luck abandoned him. His pile of winnings shrank, then vanished, until only scraps remained. Sweat gathered at his temples, though he masked it with bravado, slamming cards down with a grin that did not reach his eyes. Each loss was a cut, and by the time the clock crept past midnight, he was bleeding pride onto the table with every play. The enslaved man stood in the shadows, silent as always, brought into the room not as a participant but as property, another measure of wealth on display. He had seen this before. Masters wagering horses, land, even other enslaved souls, as though the lives and labor of men and women were nothing but chips in a game. But tonight was different. Tonight the master was unraveling, his desperation plain to anyone who looked closely enough. His hands shook when he raised his glass. His smile faltered with every lost round. The room smelled not only of smoke, but of impending ruin. The other players sensed it. They pressed him harder, raising stakes, baiting him into riskier plays. And like a moth to flame, he leapt at every chance, unable to resist. Soon his land was gone. His horses were gone. His last reserves of coin and credit slipped through his fingers like sand. And then, as silence fell over the table, he looked down at his empty hands, his pockets barren. The men around him leaned back in their chairs, smirking, waiting. Surely the game was over. Surely he had nothing left to give. But then his eyes shifted, first to the enslaved man in the corner, then to the thought of the only thing more precious he still possessed. His daughter, his pride, his legacy, his blood. The room held its breath as his lips curled into a smile both daring and dangerous. He leaned forward, his voice low, carrying just enough for all to hear. One more hand, he said, but not for coin, not for land. He gestured toward the enslaved man, his hand trembling ever so slightly. Him, against something greater. The men around the table straightened, their smirks faltering into astonishment. The master's voice grew firmer, fueled by the madness of desperation. I'll stake my daughter, my flesh and blood, against this slave, one hand. Winner takes all. For a moment, silence smothered the room. Even the candles seemed to flicker uneasily. Then nervous laughter broke out, uncertain, disbelieving. Had he truly said it? Had he truly offered such a thing? The enslaved man stood frozen, his face a mask, though within him a storm surely raged. To be compared, to be wagered, not even against another slave, but against a master's own child. It was both insult and revelation. Proof of how far greed could drag a man into madness. Some of the players objected, their pride as fathers and men recoiling at the indecency. Others leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle, eager to witness a story no one would ever forget. But the master would not be swayed. His eyes burned with defiance, daring anyone to call him coward, daring fate itself to deny him this final gamble. And so the cards were dealt. The table grew quiet, every man watching, every breath drawn slowly as destiny shuffled itself into place. The master's hands trembled as he picked up his cards, his face flushed with brandy and desperation. The enslaved man, pulled unwillingly into the moment, watched in silence, his very life balanced on the edge of a game he had not chosen to play. The air was heavy, thick with smoke and dread. When the final card touched the table, when the last bet was placed, history itself seemed to hold its breath. For in that instant, the future of a daughter, the dignity of a slave, and the pride of a master all collided in one reckless wager that would echo far beyond that smoky parlor. And as the players leaned forward, eyes wide, hearts pounding, they knew this was no ordinary hand of cards. This was the night Virginia's honor would crumble, and a family's name would be forever stained by the price of arrogance. The cards lay on the table like silent judges, their painted faces catching the flicker of candlelight. The air was so heavy that even the smoke seemed to pause, curling slowly upward as if reluctant to move. Around the oak table, the men leaned closer, their laughter gone, their voices silenced by the weight of the wager. No one dared break the spell, for what sat before them was not merely a game of poker. It was a moment where pride, flesh, and blood balanced on the edge of chance. The master's hand trembled as he held his cards, the veins in his forehead pulsing with the strain of composure. His bravado had carried him this far, but now his eyes betrayed him. They darted, restless, calculating, as though he might wrestle victory from the cards through sheer will. Sweat slicked his brow and his lips pressed into a thin line. In his mind, he saw not the faces of the men around him, but the ghosts of his losses, land gone, coin gone, livestock gone. Everything gone, everything but the wager he had now dared to place. Across from him, the enslaved man sat with a stillness that unnerved those who watched. His hands were folded before him, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. He had not asked to be here, had not chosen this fight. Yet here he was, his very life set against that of a young woman he had likely seen from afar. A girl as much a prisoner of her father's pride as he was of his chains. If fear coursed through him, he gave no sign. His silence was its own defiance, louder than any protest could have been. The dealer's hands moved with ritual precision, laying the final card down as though placing a seal on destiny itself. The room held its breath. The master glanced at his cards again, his chest rising and falling with the quick rhythm of panic. He slammed them down on the table with a flourish, his voice breaking the silence. "Three of a kind," he declared, his tone sharp, his grin forced. He leaned back in his chair, trying to mask his desperation with a performance of triumph. "Enough to win what's mine." A murmur rippled around the room. For a heartbeat it seemed he had done it, that fortune had returned to him at the very edge of ruin. His eyes darted to the enslaved man, daring him to reveal anything less. The master's fingers drummed against the table, already reaching for victory, already imagining the smirk of satisfaction that would erase his humiliation. Then came the reveal. With steady hands, the enslaved man placed his cards gently on the table one by one. First a pair, then another. The room grew still. And then the final card. A full house. Stronger, higher, enough to shatter the master's illusion of control. For a moment, silence swallowed the room whole. The master stared, unblinking, his grin frozen on his face, unable to comprehend what lay before him. His fingers clutched at the table's edge as though holding it tightly could keep the truth from slipping away. His lips moved, but no words came. Across from him, the enslaved man remained motionless, his expression neither gloating nor fearful, only calm, like a man who had long ago learned that triumph and suffering often walked side by side. Then the room erupted. Gasps, whispers, and nervous laughter tumbled out of the men around the table. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others muttered curses under their breath, unable to fathom the recklessness they had just witnessed. A master of Virginia, a man of standing and name, had wagered his daughter against a slave and lost. The master lurched forward, his hands snatching at the cards as though he could alter their faces by force. His voice, once booming with arrogance, cracked like brittle wood. "No, this cannot be. The cards lie!" Another hand. "I'll win it back." But the rules of the game were clear, and every man present knew it. A bet made was a bet kept. The enslaved man did not speak, for what could he say? His life had been played like a token, and now, by the twisted logic of the master's wager, he had won more than freedom. He had won claim over the master's own daughter. A claim he had never sought, a burden no man should bear, and yet the table bore witness to it. The daughter herself was not in the room, but her fate had been sealed in absentia. Her life bartered away by the very man meant to protect her. The scandal of it would spread like wildfire. Fathers would whisper of it to their sons as a warning of pride's downfall. Mothers would weep at the indecency of it, and the daughter, innocent of her father's sins, would bear the shame of being reduced to a wager in a game of chance. The master slumped in his chair, his bravado gone, his face ashen. He had not only lost a game, he had lost his dignity, his legacy, his claim to honor. His daughter's fate was now tangled in the consequences of his arrogance, and Virginia itself would carry the weight of the tale. For in that one hand of cards, everything changed. The men gathered their winnings, their laughter returning in uneasy bursts, eager to distance themselves from the scandal that now filled the room. Yet none could truly escape it, for each had borne witness to the fall of a master and the rise of a truth no one wished to acknowledge, that even the powerful could destroy themselves with their own greed. And so the game ended, not with triumph but with ruin. The cards lay scattered across the table like fallen soldiers, silent reminders of a night when pride gambled against destiny and lost. Now the question turns not to the master, but to his daughter, who would awake the next morning to a world forever altered by her father's folly. What became of her, how she bore the shame and weight of his decision, is a story that cuts even deeper into the heart of this tragedy. She was not in the room when her father spoke her name like a coin tossed onto the table. She did not see the cards fall, nor hear the gasps of men as her fate was sealed in smoke and candlelight. Yet when dawn broke over the fields of Virginia, the whispers carried faster than the morning sun. Servants murmured, neighbors recoiled, and by the time she stepped from her chamber, her life was no longer her own. She was no longer simply the daughter of a master. She was the girl who had been wagered and lost. Her world had always been one of contradiction. She had grown up surrounded by luxury, lace gowns, silver spoons, and the polished wood of her father's grand estate. She had been taught to smile politely at gatherings, to play the piano when guests arrived, to carry herself as a symbol of refinement and family pride. Yet beneath that veneer, she had long known her father's flaws. She had seen him stumble home late at night, smelling of brandy and smoke. She had heard the arguments with creditors, the angry shouts that rattled the walls. She had even glimpsed the moments when his temper turned cruel toward the enslaved, his rage spilling onto those who could not defend themselves. Still, nothing could have prepared her for the morning when she learned that she herself had been reduced to a wager. At first, she did not believe it. The idea was too grotesque, too shameful to accept. Her father, her protector, her blood, had staked her life against that of another human being, as though she were property, as though her worth could be measured in cards. The humiliation burned hotter than fire. She wept not only for herself, but for the truth it revealed, that in her father's eyes, she had never been more than an extension of his pride, another possession he believed he could barter. The household fell into chaos. Servants whispered behind doors, their eyes darting away when she passed. Her name, once spoken with admiration, was now tainted, wrapped in scandal. Neighbors who had once courted her family's favor now kept their distance, their words sharp with judgment when they spoke at all. To them she was not an innocent daughter. She was the symbol of her father's disgrace, a reminder that even the highest families could be dragged into ruin by arrogance. And yet, beyond the shame, there was fear. What did it mean to be wagered and lost? Was she to be taken, delivered like a parcel to the man her father had played against? The enslaved man, whose very existence had been weighed against hers. She knew little of him, only that he had labored in the shadows of her father's estate, quiet and watchful. Now, through no choice of his own, he was bound to her story forever. The thought filled her with dread, not because of who he was, but because of the sheer indecency of what had been done. Two lives, hers and his, intertwined by a gamble neither had chosen. For the enslaved, the outcome carried its own impossible weight. For her, it was the destruction of identity, the collapse of every certainty she had been raised to believe. She no longer belonged to herself. Her fate was a story told in hushed tones across Virginia, a scandal that mothers whispered to daughters as a warning, a tale of what happens when pride devours a family from within. The daughter carried herself with as much dignity as she could, but behind closed doors, she was broken. Nights passed sleepless, her eyes red from tears, her heart hollowed by betrayal. She loved her father once, but now she could not even look at him without seeing the moment he had traded her future for the turn of a card. He had not only lost a game, he had lost her trust, her love, and the very essence of what it meant to be a father. In time, she became more than just a victim of circumstance. She became a symbol, unwilling though she was. Her fate was discussed in whispers at church pews, in letters passed between families, in gossip carried along the dusty roads of Virginia. To some, she was a cautionary tale. To others, she was a tragic figure, caught in a web spun by greed and arrogance. And to herself, she was a prisoner. Of her father's sin, of society's cruelty, of a story she never asked to be part of. What exactly became of her is lost to history's silence. Did she remain at the estate forever shamed? Was she sent away, hidden from prying eyes? Or was she, in some twisted interpretation of the wager, handed into a fate too cruel to imagine? The truth has been buried beneath time, but the echoes remain. Her suffering was real, her humiliation unforgettable, and her name, though never recorded in ledgers, became the whispered reminder of how low Virginia's proudest could fall. Her father's gamble had cost him everything, but it was she who bore the heaviest price. In her, the innocence of a daughter was sacrificed to the arrogance of a master, and in her, the corruption of Virginia was laid bare. For the tale of her fate was not just her own, it was the reflection of a society willing to reduce both enslaved men and free daughters to the level of property. Tokens in a game where humanity itself was the stake. And now, with her story etched into our minds, we turn back to the man who set it all into motion. The master whose pride and folly dragged his family name into ruin. For while his daughter carried the shame, he carried the downfall. And his collapse would become the clearest proof that greed devours all it touches. The night of the wager did not end when the last card was thrown onto the table. For the master, it lingered like a shadow, following him into every corner of his once proud estate. He returned home that evening not as a victor, not even as a man who had merely lost, but as something far worse, a spectacle. The whispers had already begun before the candles were snuffed. Virginia's soil carried rumors faster than any rider, and by morning, the scandal of his gamble clung to his name like mud that could never be scrubbed clean. At first, he tried to walk with the same swagger, puffing his chest, barking orders at his servants, forcing laughter at the breakfast table. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted nervously whenever conversation hushed around him. He could hear it. Neighbors speaking in lowered tones, men mocking him at the tavern, women covering their mouths with handkerchiefs as he passed. A master of Virginia reduced to ridicule. Pride had been the mask he wore, but now it was stripped away, leaving only a hollow man exposed before all. His wealth, already dwindling from years of reckless gambling, slipped through his fingers faster than water. Creditors came knocking, no longer patient, no longer willing to lend on his name. His lands shrank, sold off piece by piece to cover debts he could no longer manage. The estate that once stood as a monument to his family's prestige began to crack. Paint-peeled fences leaned, fields went untended. The grandeur that had defined him dissolved into decay, mirroring the ruin within his soul. Yet it was not only wealth he lost, it was respect. Virginia's aristocracy had lived on the illusion of honor, the belief that their word carried weight, that their bloodlines were untainted by scandal. But the master had shattered that illusion. To wager his daughter against a man he himself enslaved was not only reckless, it was obscene. His peers did not forgive him. They shunned him at gatherings, turned cold shoulders at markets, withheld invitations to dinners where reputations were polished like silver. To them, he was no longer one of them. He had stained their shared identity, and his fall was a reminder that their own seats of power rested on a fragile pedestal. Within his own household, the downfall was harsher still. His daughter, once his pride, now could not even meet his eyes without tears welling in her own. Every word he spoke to her carried the weight of betrayal. Her silence became his punishment. For the enslaved, too, there was a shift. Though they dared not speak it aloud, their eyes carried a new kind of judgment. They had seen his weakness, seen him unravel, seen him reveal the corruption of his heart for all to witness. And in those silent glances he felt his authority slipping. He was master in title, but no longer in truth. The bottle became his refuge. Nights stretched long as he drowned his humiliation in brandy, the firelight flickering across his sunken face. The man who once strutted with arrogance now muttered to himself, replaying the game in fevered whispers. One more hand. If only one more hand. His laughter turned bitter, his rages violent. The sound of shattering glass became common in the halls of the estate. Servants learned to step carefully to avoid his gaze when drink glazed his eyes with fury. But there was no hand left to play, no chance to undo what had been done. His daughter bore the shame, his estate bore the ruin, and his name became a curse. Where once men had tipped hats to him, they now muttered fool under their breath. Where once his daughter might have been courted by wealthy suitors, now no respectable family would dare align their name with his. And where once he commanded with pride, now even his commands carried desperation. The true cruelty of his downfall was not that he lost everything, but that he lost himself. Pride had been the core of his being, and when that pride was broken, nothing remained. He had gambled not only with cards, but with the very foundation of his life. His family, his wealth, his honor, his soul, all thrown into the pot, all swept away by a single hand. And as his estate rotted, so too did the larger world around him. For his scandal was not only personal, it became symbolic. Virginia itself, with its wealth built on human suffering, with its honor propped up by cruelty, now carried the stain of his story. He was not just a ruined man. He was a mirror held up to a society already cracking under the weight of its own hypocrisy. His ruin was Virginia's ruin. His shame was Virginia's shame. By the end, he was a shell of the man who once strutted through candlelit halls, a ghost walking the remnants of a house that had become his prison. No one remembered his victories, his wealth, or his power. They remembered only the night he wagered away his daughter, and with her, the last shreds of his dignity. And so, the master's downfall was complete. Pride had built him, greed had driven him, and shame had destroyed him. But his ruin did not remain his alone. It spilled outward, staining the very soil of Virginia, leaving behind a legacy that whispered long after his death. Yet, while his name dissolved into disgrace, the story itself endured, not just as a tale of one man's collapse, but as a reflection of the society that allowed such cruelty to flourish. And that brings us to the greater picture, the wider consequence. How Virginia itself was scarred by his folly, how a single man's wager became a symbol of a system unraveling. The tale of the wager did not end at the master's estate, nor with the shame that hung heavy over his ruined family. It seeped outward, carried on whispers and scandal, across Virginia's fields and towns, into parlors and churches, into the very bloodstream of a society that prided itself on honor while standing upon foundations of cruelty. His downfall was not just his own, it became Virginia's. The South in those years before the Civil War held itself aloft on the illusion of nobility. Plantation masters called themselves gentlemen, draped their wealth in ceremony, and spoke of tradition as though it were unbreakable law. They boasted of lineage, of hospitality, of a society built on refinement, but beneath the polished surface was rot. Slavery was the silent engine that powered every mansion, every lavish feast, every poker game played in smoke-filled rooms. Human suffering lay buried beneath the marble floors, just as surely as chains clinked in the shadows of their fields. And so, when the story spread that a master had gambled his daughter against a man he enslaved, it struck deeper than mere scandal. It tore at the myth of Southern honor. How could gentlemen claim refinement, claim dignity, when one of their own had revealed the truth so nakedly, that their wealth was nothing but a deck of cards, their honor nothing but a mask, their families as fragile as any coin tossed on a table? The whispers were merciless. In Richmond's drawing rooms, in the pews of Charleston churches, in letters carried by post riders across the South, the tale grew. Some told it as a warning, pride brings ruin. Others told it with relish, delighted in the fall of a man too arrogant for his own good. But underneath every retelling was the same uneasy truth, that his wager was not an accident, not a mere slip of madness, but the natural consequence of a society that saw people, whether enslaved or free daughters, as possessions to be traded. Virginia, once called the cradle of American statesmen, now carried this shame like a scar across its face. It was not just that a master had fallen. It was that his fall revealed the fragility of the entire system. If one man could gamble away his daughter, then what did that say about the values that Virginia claimed to uphold? What did it say about the dignity of families who built their prestige on human bondage? Some tried to bury the story, to silence the scandal, to pretend it was the madness of a single fool, but the tale refused to die. It resurfaced again and again, whispered like a ghost at gatherings, a reminder of the cracks forming in the South's proud image. To the enslaved, it was a bitter truth laid bare, that the masters who claimed superiority were just as enslaved by their greed as the people they chained to the fields. To the poor whites who looked up to the planters, it was a glimpse that these so-called gentlemen were not gods but gamblers, weak men who could ruin their families with the turn of a card. And to the wider world, it was yet another stain on Virginia's name, another story that revealed the deep contradictions of a land that spoke of liberty while practicing bondage. The scandal of the wager became a parable, a symbol of how corruption eats away at societies that refuse to confront their own sins. The daughter, the enslaved man, even the estate itself, all became part of Virginia's legend, woven into the fabric of its identity. Long after the master's death, long after the estate crumbled into ruin, travelers spoke of it as they passed by the empty land. Some said you could still feel the weight of that night in the silence of the fields. Others swore that the house with its broken windows and sagging roof stood as a monument to the folly of its owner. But the deeper legacy was not the ruin of one man's house. It was the ruin of Virginia's honor, for the master had exposed something everyone already knew but refused to speak. That the South's grandeur was built on degradation. That the very concept of family honor could be twisted into something monstrous. That the veneer of civilization was only a thin coat of paint over greed and cruelty. His fall was a warning, but Virginia did not heed it. In the years that followed, the cracks widened, debts mounted, tempers flared, the North and South drifted toward collision, and when the Civil War finally tore through the land, some looked back at stories like his and saw the writing that had always been on the wall. A society that wages its daughters and enslaves its sons cannot stand forever. Its collapse is inevitable. Thus, the master's story became more than a scandal. It became a prophecy. His downfall was not isolated. It was a reflection of the decay of the entire South, a foretaste of the destruction that awaited Virginia and all who clung to its illusions of power and nobility. Even now, the tale lingers, not as entertainment but as a warning, that greed destroys, that cruelty corrupts, and that societies built on injustice will one day gamble away everything they claim to cherish. The master lost his wealth, his daughter, his dignity, but Virginia lost something greater, its illusion of honor. And that stain, once made, can never be erased. And so, from the ashes of his scandal, we turn to the final piece of this tale, the lesson it carries for us today. For history is not only about the past, it is a mirror, and in it we must see ourselves. History does not simply vanish when the last card is laid down, nor does it remain buried in dusty ledgers. It lingers, like smoke after a fire, clinging to the walls of memory, whispering warnings to those who dare to listen. The tale of the Virginia master who wagered his daughter against a man he enslaved may seem like an isolated scandal, a grotesque curiosity from the past. But if we look closely, if we strip away the details of time and place, we see that it is more than a single man's ruin. It is a mirror, and in its reflection we find truths that still burn today. The master's gamble was born of pride, greed, and dehumanization. He saw people, his daughter, his enslaved laborers, not as human beings with lives and dignity, but as objects, extensions of his wealth, tokens to be played. And for that blindness he paid the ultimate price. His wealth crumbled, his reputation rotted, his legacy dissolved into scandal. Yet what destroyed him was not merely the turn of a card. It was his refusal to see humanity in others. And is that lesson not timeless? How often has history shown us that when power blinds itself to humanity, destruction follows? Empires that thrived on conquest eventually collapsed under the weight of their own cruelty. Families that worshipped wealth lost their foundations when greed devoured them from within. Even today, the story whispers to us. When we treat people as less than human, when pride overrides compassion, when greed trumps dignity, we set the stage for ruin. The daughter's fate, too, speaks across centuries. She was innocent, yet she bore the weight of her father's arrogance. She became a symbol of how the sins of one generation fall upon the next. How many times in history, and even now, have the choices of the powerful crushed those who never asked to bear the burden? Children born into poverty, families displaced by war, communities broken by greed. They echo her story, carrying the scars of decisions they never made. And what of the enslaved man, silent yet strong? He did not choose the wager, yet he became its center. His calm defiance, his quiet humanity, became the unspoken truth that shattered the master's illusion of superiority. He reminds us that dignity can exist even in chains, that strength is not always shouted, but sometimes whispered in silence. He stands as a symbol of resilience, of the unbreakable human spirit in the face of cruelty. The master's downfall became Virginia's stain, a glimpse of the cracks already forming in the South. But those cracks were not confined to one state or one era. They belong to every society that builds its pride on the suffering of others. His story is a warning not to any single people, but to all of us. Pride without compassion, wealth without justice, power without humanity. These are the wagers that doom nations, families, and souls alike. As the Civil War loomed, Virginia paid the price for centuries of cruelty, just as the master paid the price for his arrogance. His ruin was a smaller echo of the destruction that awaited the South. And perhaps that is why this tale lingers, because it shows us that the seeds of collapse are sown not in moments of weakness, but in the long, slow arrogance of refusing to see others as equals. So what do we take from this today? We live in a world still scarred by greed, still torn by inequality, still tempted to treat human lives as bargaining chips in the pursuit of power. Whether in boardrooms, governments, or even within families, the same mistake lurks. The belief that people can be reduced to possessions, that pride can excuse cruelty, that dignity can be bought and sold. The lesson of Virginia's master is clear. To gamble with humanity is to gamble with your own destruction. To deny the dignity of others is to hollow out your own. Pride may glitter for a time, but when it consumes love, compassion, and justice, it always burns itself to ash. And so, as we close this story, we turn the question to you. Was it only one man's downfall, or was it Virginia's as well? Was it a tale of personal ruin, or a reflection of a society crumbling under its own cruelty? Perhaps it is both. Perhaps it is more. Perhaps it is a story that lives on because it must. Because every generation needs the reminder that greed and dehumanization, left unchecked, will always destroy what they claim to protect. So the cards are on the table now, not in a smoke-filled parlor in 1847, but here, in our hands, in our choices. What will we wager? Will we repeat the arrogance of the master, or will we learn the lesson carved into Virginia's soil? The past cannot be changed, but its warnings can be heard. And in the story of a man who lost everything on a single bet, we are reminded that the stakes of humanity are always higher than the cards we hold. This concludes the story. From the master's gamble to Virginia's ruin, from the daughter's fate to the legacy of shame, we are left with one truth. History does not simply tell us what happened, it tells us who we are and who we might become if we fail to listen.